The winter of 1889 brought the most vicious blizzard the Tennessee mountains had ever witnessed, and it was into this frozen hell that Ezra Whitmore found himself cast out with his 3-week-old twin daughters, banished by his own community. For a crime he didn't commit. With nothing but the clothes on his back and 2 starving infants wrapped in his dead wife's shawl, he stumbled through the killing cold until exhaustion claimed him at the edge of a frozen creek. It was there that Ayanna Cloudwalker, a Cherokee tracker following winter game trails, would discover what appeared to be 3 frozen corpses and make a decision that would forever change the course of 4 desperate lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Ezra Whitmore had been the most respected blacksmith in Millerville, a small Tennessee mountain town where his family had lived for 3 generations. His forge produced the finest horseshoes, tools, and ironwork in 3 counties, and his reputation for honest dealing had made him prosperous by local standards. More importantly, he had been blessed with a love that most men only dream of: his wife Rebecca, a gentlewoman with golden hair and a laugh that could brighten the darkest winter day. Rebecca had been the daughter of the town's preacher, Reverend Samuel Morrison, a stern man who had initially disapproved of his daughter marrying a simple blacksmith. But Ezra's character had eventually won the old man over, and when Rebecca announced she was carrying twins, the entire family had been overjoyed. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start, with Rebecca suffering from weakness and frequent illness that confined her to bed for the final 3 months. The night the twins were born, a fierce October storm had battered Millerville. Dr. Harrison Wells, the town's physician, had struggled through the rain to reach the Whitmore cottage on the edge of town. The birth had been long and traumatic, lasting nearly 20 hours as Rebecca fought to bring their daughters into the world. When baby Sarah finally emerged, followed minutes later by her sister Grace, Ezra had wept with relief and joy as he held his tiny daughters for the first time. But Rebecca's trials were far from over. The difficult birth had left her weak and feverish, and despite Dr. Wells's efforts, her condition continued to deteriorate. For 2 weeks, Ezra barely left her bedside, caring for the twins when he could, and desperately trying to nurse his beloved wife back to health. Rebecca would rally for brief periods, holding her daughters and whispering lullabies in her failing voice, but each day brought her closer to the inevitable end. She died on a cold November morning, just as the first snow began to fall. Ezra had been feeding the twins when he heard her call his name weakly from their bedroom. By the time he reached her side, she was already slipping away, her hand growing cold in his as she whispered her final words. "Promise me you'll keep them. Safe, Ezra. Promise me they'll know how much I love them." He had made that promise through his tears, never imagining how difficult it would be to keep. The funeral had been a somber affair, with most of the town attending to pay their respects to the preacher's daughter. Ezra had stood at the graveside, holding his infant daughters, barely able to comprehend that Rebecca was truly gone. The twins were too young to understand their loss, but they seemed to sense something was wrong, crying more than usual and struggling to accept the goat's milk that had become their primary source of nutrition since their mother's death. In the weeks that followed, Ezra had thrown himself into caring for his daughters while trying to maintain his blacksmith business. Neighbor women had helped initially, bringing meals and offering to tend the babies while he worked, but as winter deepened and their own families demanded attention, the assistance had gradually dwindled. Ezra found himself struggling to balance the demanding needs of 2 infants with the physical labor required to keep his forge operating and food on the table. It was during this difficult period that disaster struck in the form of Harold Brennan, a wealthy landowner from the county seat who had long coveted Ezra's property. The Whitmore land included not only the blacksmith shop, but also valuable timber rights and a creek that never ran dry, making it highly desirable for development. Brennan had approached Ezra several times with offers to purchase the property, each time being politely but firmly refused. When direct negotiation failed, Brennan had resorted to more underhanded tactics. He began spreading rumors throughout the county that Ezra was an unfit father, that the twins were being neglected while he spent his time drinking and gambling. These lies found fertile ground among those who had always resented the Whitmore family's relative prosperity, and soon the whispers became open accusations. The situation came to a head on a bitter December morning when Sheriff Coleman arrived at Ezra's door with a warrant for his arrest. The charge was theft, specifically the accusation that he had stolen a valuable horse from Brennan's stable. Ezra protested his innocence, pointing out that he had been home with his sick daughters all week and hadn't left his property in days. But when the sheriff's deputies searched his barn, they found the missing horse, along with a distinctive saddle that Brennan identified as his own. The evidence was overwhelming, despite being completely fabricated. Brennan had arranged for the horse to be placed in Ezra's barn the night before, counting on the town's willingness to believe the worst about a man they increasingly saw as a burden on their community. The fact that Ezra had no alibi, who could verify that a grieving widower had been home alone with his infants, only strengthened the case against him. But the true horror was yet to come. As Ezra was being led away in chains, his infant daughters crying in the arms of reluctant neighbors, Brennan played his final card. He produced a document claiming that Ezra owed him substantial gambling debts that could only be satisfied by forfeiting his property. The document was a forgery, but it was expertly crafted and bore what appeared to be Ezra's signature. The trial was a farce, conducted by a judge who had been quietly bought by Brennan months earlier. Despite Ezra's impassioned testimony and the character witnesses who spoke on his behalf, the verdict was predetermined. He was found guilty of theft and fraud, sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary, and ordered to forfeit his property to satisfy his debts to Harold Brennan. But even this wasn't enough for Brennan's cruelty. As Ezra was being prepared for transport to prison, Brennan appeared with another legal document, this one claiming that Ezra's criminal conviction made him an unfit parent, and that custody of the twins should be transferred to the county orphanage. The babies would be separated and placed with different families, their true identities hidden to prevent any future claims on the property their father had lost. It was then that Ezra's desperation reached its breaking point. That night, as he sat chained in the jail cell that would be his last stop before a life behind bars, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He would escape, take his daughters, and flee into the wilderness rather than allow them to be torn from each other and raised by strangers who would never tell them the truth about their parents. The escape itself was almost ridiculously simple. The jail in Millerville was little more than a wooden building with iron bars, designed to hold drunks and minor criminals until they could be transported to more secure facilities. Ezra's years as a blacksmith had given him both the strength and the knowledge of metalwork needed to bend the bars just enough to squeeze through. He had timed his escape for the coldest night of the year, counting on the guards being huddled around their stove rather than making their usual rounds. Retrieving his daughters from the house where they were being kept required more finesse. The family caring for them were decent people who had been deceived by Brennan's lies, and Ezra was careful not to harm them as he slipped into their home in the early morning hours. Sarah and Grace were sleeping peacefully in a makeshift crib, and he bundled them gently in Rebecca's shawl, the only possession of his wife's that he had been able to save. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. By dawn, Ezra was miles from Millerville, following game trails up into the mountains with his daughters pressed against his chest. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting as far from Brennan's reach as possible. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, dogs barking, men shouting, horses thundering, along the main roads. But Ezra had chosen a path that horses couldn't follow, straight up the steepest slopes, where only a desperate man would dare to venture. The first day had been manageable, despite the bitter cold and the constant fear of capture. Ezra had found shelter in a cave, built a small fire to warm the twins, and melted snow for drinking water. The babies had been fussy, but not yet truly distressed, and he had been able to feed them some of the goat's milk he had brought in a leather pouch. But the second day brought disaster in the form of the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontal across the mountainside and making travel impossible. Ezra huddled in his inadequate shelter, watching helplessly as his supplies dwindled and his daughters grew weaker. The milk was gone, the firewood was running out, and the cold was so intense that even wrapped in his coat and Rebecca's shawl, the twins were beginning to show signs of exposure. By the third day, Ezra knew they were dying. The babies had stopped crying, which at first had seemed like a blessing, but now terrified him more than their most desperate wails. They lay limp in his arms, their breathing shallow and irregular, their tiny faces pale as the snow that continued to fall. He forced himself to leave the cave, stumbling through drifts that came up to his waist, searching desperately for any sign of help or shelter. It was then that his strength finally gave out. At the edge of a frozen creek, with his daughters clutched against his chest and the wind tearing at his clothes, Ezra Whitmore collapsed. His last conscious thought was a prayer to Rebecca, asking her forgiveness for failing to keep the promise he had made at her deathbed. The snow continued to fall, gradually covering the three still forms until they were barely visible against the white landscape. Miles away, following the tracks of a deer she had been hunting for 2 days, Ayanna Cloudwalker paused at the edge of the same creek. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the wind carried scents that didn't belong in this wilderness. Her Cherokee ancestors had taught her to trust such instincts, and she approached cautiously, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. What she found defied explanation. 3 figures lay motionless in the snow, so still that at first she assumed they were frozen corpses. But as she knelt beside them, she detected the faintest sound, the barely perceptible wheeze of breath from the smallest of the forms. With practiced efficiency, she cleared snow from their faces and felt for pulses, her heart racing as she realized what she had discovered. A man and 2 babies, all on the verge of death from exposure, lying in the middle of Cherokee territory where no white people should have been. The smart thing would have been to leave them. Her own people had suffered enough at the hands of white settlers, and getting involved would only bring trouble. But as she looked at the tiny faces of the infants, blue with cold, but still breathing, Ayanna knew she couldn't walk away. The decision to save them would change everything, though she couldn't know it yet. In that moment, kneeling in the snow beside 3 strangers who represented everything her people had learned to fear and distrust, Ayanna Cloudwalker chose compassion over caution. She lifted the smallest baby first, feeling the flutter of a heartbeat against her palm, and began the race against time that would either save 3 lives or claim 4. The storm showed no signs of abating, and her own shelter was more than a mile away through treacherous terrain. But Ayanna had been tracking and surviving in these mountains since childhood, and she had resources that the desperate father had lacked. As she began the difficult journey back to safety, carrying burdens she had never expected to bear, she couldn't have imagined that this moment of mercy would lead to the most extraordinary chapter of her life. Behind her, the wind erased all traces of their passage, as if the mountain itself was conspiring to hide the secret of what had transpired. In this remote valley, the blizzard raged on, but for the first time in days, there was hope in the frozen wilderness, fragile and uncertain, but real nonetheless. Ayana Cloudwalker had carried dying people through winter storms before, but never three at once, and never with stakes this high. As she struggled through the blizzard with baby Grace pressed against her chest and little Sarah secured in a makeshift sling across her back, she could feel their father's weight dragging behind her on the emergency travois she had hastily constructed from pine branches and her own winter cloak. Every few minutes she stopped to check their breathing, her heart clenching each time she found their pulses growing weaker. The journey to her winter shelter normally took 20 minutes on a clear day. In the blinding snow, carrying 3 people. On the edge of death, it stretched into an eternity of desperate struggle. Ayana's ancestors had taught her that the mountains tested every soul who dared to challenge them, but they had never prepared her for this moment, when 3 lives hung. In the balance of her own endurance, her breath came in ragged gasps, her muscles screamed in protest, and ice formed on her eyelashes until she could barely see the familiar landmarks that guided her path. When she finally reached the hidden cave that served as her winter base camp, Ayana wasted no time on relief. Years of training as a healer and tracker had taught her to prioritize in crisis situations, and right now the babies were closest to death. She laid them carefully on the thick bear hide that served as her bed, stripping away their wet clothes and wrapping them in warm, dry furs, while she built up the fire that was always kept burning in the cave's natural chimney. The man, their father, she assumed, was a different challenge entirely. He was much larger than she was, and moving his unconscious form required strength she wasn't sure she possessed. But Cherokee women were raised to be resourceful, and Ayana used a combination of leverage and determination to drag him closer. To the fire. His clothes were soaked through and frozen in places, and she knew that leaving him in wet garments would kill him as surely as the cold already threatening his life. For a moment, Ayana hesitated. She had never undressed a white man before, and the cultural taboos of her people warred with the practical necessity of saving his life. But as she watched his lips turn blue and felt the irregular flutter of his pulse, she pushed aside her discomfort and began the difficult process of removing his frozen clothing. She worked with clinical efficiency, focusing on the medical emergency rather than the cultural implications, wrapping him in warm furs and positioning him where the fire's heat would gradually restore his body temperature. The babies were her next priority, and here her knowledge of traditional Cherokee medicine proved invaluable. She had prepared a special tea from willow bark and other healing herbs, sweetened with honey and diluted with warm water until it was safe for infants. Using a small piece of soft leather, she managed to get a few drops into each baby's mouth, watching anxiously as they swallowed reflexively. Their color improved slightly, though they remained frighteningly still. As the hours passed, Ayana found herself playing a delicate balancing game between caring for her 3 unexpected patients and maintaining the fire that was their lifeline. She had enough wood to last several days, but the storm showed no signs of abating, and she knew that rescue parties would be unable to reach them until the weather cleared. She was completely on her own, responsible for 3 lives that depended entirely on her skills and resources. The man began to stir first, sometime during the second night of the storm. Ayana had been dozing fitfully beside the fire, one hand always touching the babies to monitor their breathing, when she heard a low groan from the other side of the cave. She moved quickly to his side, speaking softly in English, a language she had learned from her grandmother, who had been forced to attend the white man's school as a child. "You are safe," she said simply, placing a gentle hand on his forehead to check for fever. "Do not try to move too quickly. You nearly died in the storm." Ezra's eyes opened slowly, confusion and fear evident in their depths as he struggled to focus on her face. "My daughters," he whispered hoarsely, trying to sit up despite his weakness. "Where are my—" "They are here," Ayanna assured him, helping him turn his head so he could see the twins sleeping peacefully in their nest of furs. "They are alive, but they were very sick. I have been giving them medicine." Relief flooded Ezra's features, followed quickly by bewilderment as he took in his surroundings. The cave was larger than he had expected, with natural stone formations that created separate areas for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Native American artifacts and tools were arranged with careful precision, and the woman caring for them was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Ayanna was perhaps 25 years old, with long black hair braided with small feathers and beads. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional Cherokee garments and practical winter gear, and her movements showed the grace and confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Dark, intelligent, and filled with a compassion that seemed to transcend the cultural barriers between them. "You saved us," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why, but you saved us." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, feeding small pieces of wood to the fire. "My grandmother used to say that the Great Spirit sometimes puts people in our path for reasons we cannot understand," she finally replied. "Perhaps this is one of those times." Over the next few days, as the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, an unusual routine developed. Ayanna tended to the babies with the expertise of someone who had helped raise many children in her community, while Ezra gradually regained his strength. The twins responded well to her care, their color returning to normal, and their breathing becoming stronger with each passing hour. But it was during the quiet moments, when the babies slept and the wind howled outside, that the real conversation began. Ezra found himself telling this remarkable woman things he had never shared with anyone. His grief over Rebecca's death, his desperation to protect his daughters, and the injustice that had driven him to flee into the wilderness. "This man who took your land," Ayanna said one evening, as they shared a meal of venison stew and cornbread she had prepared from her supplies. "He did this for money?" Ezra nodded bitterly. "Harold Brennan has been trying to steal our property for years. When I refused to sell, he found another way to take it. He had me framed for theft, bribed the judge, and then claimed custody of my daughters so they couldn't inherit what was rightfully theirs." Ayanna's expression hardened. "My people know such men. They take what they want and call it law." She looked toward the babies, who were sleeping peacefully after their evening feeding. "What will you do now? You cannot go back to your town." "I don't know," Ezra admitted. "I hadn't thought beyond getting away from Brennan. I suppose I hope to find somewhere safe to raise Sarah and Grace, but I have no money, no home, and I'm a wanted man. What kind of life can I give them?" "Perhaps," Ayanna said carefully, "you are thinking about this wrong. Perhaps the question is not what you can give them, but what they need to survive and grow strong." This conversation continued over several days, each exchange revealing more about their different worlds and perspectives. Ezra learned that Ayanna was not just a tracker and healer, but also a storyteller and keeper of Cherokee traditions. She had been living alone in the wilderness for 2 years, following the seasonal migrations of game and gathering medicinal plants that she traded with both Cherokee and white settlements. "Why do you live alone?" Ezra asked one morning as they watched the twins playing with small wooden toys Ayanna had carved for them. "Surely your people would welcome you back." Ayanna's face clouded with old pain. "My people were forced to leave these mountains when I was a child. Most went west on what you call the Trail of Tears. Some stayed, hiding in remote places, but they live in fear of being discovered and sent away. I chose a different path, to remain here as guardian of the old ways, keeping the sacred sites protected and the traditional knowledge alive." "That must be very lonely," Ezra observed. "Sometimes," she acknowledged, "but I have always believed that the Great Spirit has a purpose for my solitude. Perhaps this is it, to be here when three." Lives needed saving. As the storm finally began to abate on the fourth day, both Ezra and Ayanna knew that decisions would have to be made soon. The babies were now thriving, gurgling and smiling in response to attention, but they would need more than cave shelter and wilderness survival to grow into healthy children. Ezra's legal troubles had not disappeared, and returning to white society would mean risking capture and the loss of his daughters. It was during one of these planning discussions that Ayanna made a suggestion that surprised them both. "There is a place," she said slowly, "where Cherokee families still live in secret. It is far from here, deeper in the mountains, where white lawmen do not venture. They have children, and they would welcome more. Your daughters could grow up there, safe from those who would harm them." Ezra considered this possibility with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "And what of me? Would they accept a white man who brings trouble?" "That would depend," Ayanna replied honestly, "on many things. But children are precious to my people, especially children who have no other protection. They would not turn away orphans, even if their father is white." "You said orphans," Ezra noted, "but I'm not dead." Ayanna met his gaze directly. "No, but Ezra Whitmore is wanted by white law. Perhaps he could remain dead to that world, while a new man learns to live in a different one." The implications of this suggestion were staggering. Ezra would have to abandon not just his old life, but his very identity, taking on a new name and new ways of living. It would mean learning Cherokee customs, accepting their authority over his children's upbringing, and trusting in the goodwill of people who had every reason to distrust white men. But as he looked at his daughters, now healthy and happy in Ayanna's care, Ezra realized that his old life was already gone. Harold Brennan had destroyed everything he had built, and there was no going back to the world that had rejected him. Perhaps it was time to embrace a completely different future, one that his daughters could share without fear or shame. "If we did this," he said carefully, "would you come with us? The babies know you now, and I would feel safer knowing you were there to help them adjust." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as she considered his request. Finally, she nodded. "Yes. I think perhaps it is time for me to return to my people. And these little ones will need someone who can teach them both worlds, the one they were born into and the one that has chosen to protect them." Outside the cave, the storm was finally beginning to clear, and the first rays of sunlight in days were streaming through the entrance. But inside, 3 adults and 2 babies were just beginning a journey that would transform them all in ways they could not yet imagine. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The path ahead would be difficult and dangerous, requiring them to cross through territory controlled by hostile forces while caring for 2 infants. But for the first time since Rebecca's death, Ezra felt a spark of hope for his daughter's future. And for Ayanna, the solitary guardian of Cherokee traditions, the prospect of returning to her people with a new family to protect felt like the fulfillment of a destiny she had never dared to dream. As they began to prepare for the journey that would change everything, none of them could have predicted the challenges and revelations that awaited them in the hidden Cherokee settlement. But they faced the uncertain future together, bound by the shared experience of survival and the growing realization that some families are forged not by blood, but by the courage to save each other when all hope seems lost. The morning they left, the cave marked the beginning of the most dangerous journey any of them had ever attempted. Ayanna had spent the previous evening creating an intricate plan that would take them through Cherokee territory while avoiding both white settlements and military patrols. The route she had chosen was treacherous even in good weather, a series of ancient hunting trails that wound through the most remote parts of the Tennessee mountains, crossing territories that few white men had ever seen. But their greatest challenge wasn't the terrain. It was traveling with two infants who needed constant care while maintaining absolute silence through areas where discovery could mean death for all of them. Ayanna had solved this problem with typical Cherokee ingenuity, creating specialized carriers that would keep the babies warm, secure, and quiet during the most dangerous portions of their journey. She had also prepared a supply of natural sedatives, mild herbal preparations that would help the twins sleep during critical moments when crying could betray their location. Ezra watched in fascination as Ayanna transformed herself for the journey ahead. Gone was the woman who had nursed them back to health in the cave's warmth. In her place stood a Cherokee warrior tracker whose every movement spoke of deadly competence. She had painted her face with traditional war markings, armed herself with weapons he hadn't even known she possessed, and adopted a demeanor that was both protective and terrifying. "From this moment until we reach safety," she told him as they prepared to leave, "you must do exactly as I say when I say it, without question or hesitation. In Cherokee territory, I am war chief. In white territory, you must guide us, but in the places between, the no-man's lands where neither law applies, we survive only by trusting each other completely." Their first day of travel revealed just how carefully Ayanna had planned their route. She led them along ridgelines that provided natural cover while offering escape routes in multiple directions. Every few hours, she would stop to examine tracks, test wind direction, and listen for sounds that Ezra couldn't even detect. Her knowledge of the mountains was so complete that she seemed to anticipate obstacles before they appeared, guiding them around areas where the snow was too deep or the footing too treacherous for safe passage with the babies. But it was during their first encounter with other humans that Ezra truly understood the precariousness of their situation. On the second day, as they descended into a valley that Ayanna had assured him was uninhabited, they heard voices echoing off the canyon walls. Ayanna immediately signaled for absolute silence, taking baby Grace from Ezra's arms and disappearing into a cluster of boulders so quickly that he barely saw where she had gone. Moments later, a patrol of 6 soldiers emerged from the tree line, moving in formation and clearly searching for something or someone. Ezra pressed himself against the rock face, holding Sarah so tightly that he feared he might hurt her, while listening to the soldiers' conversation drift up from the valley below. "Captain says the fugitives definitely in these mountains," one of them was saying. "Reward's been increased to $500 for the man, and there's another 100 each for information about the babies." $700, another soldier whistled low. "That's more than most of us make in 2 years. What's so special about this blacksmith that Brennan's willing to pay that much? Word is, he's got something on Brennan, evidence that could put him in prison if it ever comes to light. Brennan wants him found before he can make it to a territorial judge who ain't in his pocket." Ezra's blood ran cold as he realized the true extent of Brennan's desperation. It wasn't just about the land anymore. Brennan was terrified that Ezra might somehow expose his criminal activities to honest authorities. The bounty on their heads meant that they couldn't trust anyone, that every encounter with other humans was potentially fatal. The soldiers spent nearly an hour searching the valley, coming so close to their hiding place that Ezra could see the details of their uniforms. Throughout the entire ordeal, both babies remained mysteriously quiet, and Ezra later learned that Ayanna had given them tiny doses of her herbal sedative before the patrol appeared. Her ability to sense danger before it materialized probably saved all their lives that day. After the soldiers departed, Ayanna led them even deeper into wilderness areas that existed on no official maps. Here, the landscape took on an almost mystical quality, with ancient Cherokee symbols carved into rock faces and sacred sites that had been protected for generations. Ayanna moved through these areas with reverent familiarity, occasionally stopping to perform brief ceremonies or leave offerings at places that held special significance. It was at one of these sacred sites, a natural spring surrounded by standing stones, that they encountered their first Cherokee patrol. Ezra never saw them coming. One moment he and Ayanna were refilling their water containers while the babies slept nearby, and the next moment they were surrounded by 5 Cherokee warriors whose appearance was so sudden and silent that they might have materialized from the rocks themselves. The confrontation that followed was entirely in Cherokee, a rapid exchange between Ayanna and the patrol leader that Ezra couldn't understand but whose intensity was unmistakable. The warriors examined him with undisguised suspicion, their hands never far from their weapons, while one of them carefully inspected the sleeping twins. The conversation grew heated at several points, with Ayanna's voice taking on tones of authority and command that surprised Ezra with their force. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the patrol leader nodded curtly and spoke a few words that caused the other warriors to step back. Ayanna turned to Ezra with an expression that was both relieved and troubled. "They will allow us to pass," she said quietly, "but there are conditions. You and the babies will be blindfolded for the final approach to the settlement. You will speak to no one except through me, and if the council decides you are a threat, you will be taken back to the boundary and released, without the children." The implications of this ultimatum hit Ezra like a physical blow. They would separate me from my daughters? "Cherokee law protects Cherokee children above all else," Ayanna replied firmly. "If they believe the babies would be safer raised as Cherokee, orphans rather than with a white father who brings danger, that is what will happen. The only way to prevent this is to prove that you can become Cherokee yourself, not just in name, but in heart and spirit." The blindfolded journey to the hidden settlement was both terrifying and surreal. Ezra found himself completely dependent on Ayanna's guidance. As they traveled for hours through terrain he couldn't see, trusting her voice and touch to keep him from stumbling over cliffs or into ravines. The babies, secured in their carriers, seemed to sense the tension and remained unusually quiet throughout the ordeal. When the blindfold was finally removed, Ezra found himself in a valley that defied everything he thought he knew about Cherokee. Survival in the post-removal era. The settlement was home to nearly 200 people living in a combination of traditional structures and ingeniously concealed buildings that would be invisible to anyone searching from above. Gardens and small farm plots were laid out with careful attention to natural camouflage, while workshops and storage areas were built into hillsides and cave systems. But it was the people themselves who truly amazed him. Here were Cherokee families who had successfully resisted forced relocation, maintaining their traditional ways while adapting to the constant threat of discovery and deportation. Children played games that had been passed down for generations, while adults practiced crafts and skills that preserved cultural knowledge the federal government was trying to erase. The council meeting that would determine their fate was held. That evening, in a traditional Cherokee council house, a seven-sided structure that represented the 7 clans of the Cherokee nation, Ezra sat with Sarah and Grace on his lap, understanding nothing of the rapid Cherokee discussion flowing around him, while Ayanna served as both translator and advocate. The questioning was thorough and sometimes hostile. Cherokee leaders wanted to know everything about his background, his reasons for fleeing, and his intentions regarding his daughter's upbringing. They were particularly interested in his skills as a blacksmith, since metalworking was a valuable trade that the settlement needed. But they were also deeply suspicious of any white man who claimed to want to live among Cherokee people, having experienced too many betrayals to accept such claims easily. The turning point came when White Fox, the settlement's eldest leader, asked Ayanna to explain why she had risked exposure by rescuing a white man and his children. Her response, delivered in Cherokee and then translated for Ezra's benefit, would echo in his memory for years to come. "I found a father dying to protect his children," she said simply. In that moment, he was not white or Cherokee. He was simply a parent doing what any parent would do. The Great Spirit does not ask about skin color when deciding who deserves to live. Neither should we. The debate continued for hours, with some council members arguing for accepting the family and others insisting that the risk was too great. It was finally decided that Ezra would be allowed to stay, but only under strict conditions. He would have to prove his commitment by undergoing traditional Cherokee adoption ceremonies, learning the language and customs, and accepting the authority of Cherokee law in all matters relating to his daughter's upbringing. Most challenging of all, he would have to earn the trust of people who had every reason to distrust him, proving through his actions that he was worthy of the sanctuary they were offering. If he failed any of these tests, or if his presence brought danger to the community, he would be banished. But his daughters would remain, raised as Cherokee children with no memory of their white father. That night, as Ezra lay in the lodge that had been assigned to them, listening to his daughter's peaceful breathing and contemplating the magnitude of the commitment he had just made, he felt both terror and gratitude in equal measure. He had saved his children from Harold Brennan's evil, but only by agreeing to a transformation so complete that Ezra Whitmore would effectively cease to exist. Outside their temporary shelter, the sounds of Cherokee daily life continued. Children laughing, adults working, the elderly sharing stories that connected past and present. Soon, if he proved worthy, Sarah and Grace would become part of this community, learning Cherokee ways alongside their father's heritage. But first, Ezra would have to prove that a desperate white fugitive could become something he had never imagined being. A Cherokee father, accepted and trusted by people whose survival depended on making the right choice about him. The hardest test lay ahead, but for the first time since Rebecca's death, Ezra dared to hope that his daughters might grow up not just safe, but surrounded by a community that would love and protect them. Whether he would be allowed to remain part of that future depended entirely on his ability to become someone new, a transformation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The Cherokee name they gave him was Kanuna, meaning the bullfrog, and Ezra initially took it as an insult until Ayanna explained that bullfrogs were considered protectors of water sources, creatures that sang to warn others of danger and whose presence indicated a healthy environment. The naming ceremony had been both humbling and terrifying, conducted entirely in Cherokee with rituals that stretched back centuries. As sacred smoke swirled around him and eagle feathers were placed in his hair, Ezra felt the last vestiges of his old identity dissolving like morning mist, but earning a Cherokee name was only the beginning of his trials. The settlement's leaders had assigned him to work under Sequoia Two Bears, the community's master craftsman, whose job was to determine whether this white refugee possessed skills valuable enough to justify the risks his presence created. 2. Bears was a man of perhaps 50 winters, with hands scarred by decades of metalwork and eyes that missed nothing. He spoke English fluently, but chose to communicate primarily in Cherokee, forcing Ezra to learn the language through immersion and necessity. The forge Two Bears had constructed was a marvel of concealed engineering, built into a natural cave system with sophisticated ventilation that dispersed smoke through multiple hidden outlets. The sound of hammering was muffled by strategic placement of water features and sound-absorbing materials, making it nearly impossible to detect from outside the settlement. Here, Cherokee smiths created everything from farming tools to weapons, maintaining the community's independence through superior craftsmanship. Ezra's first week working alongside Two Bears was a humbling experience that stripped away any arrogance he might have retained about his metalworking abilities. Cherokee techniques were different from what he had learned, emphasizing efficiency and stealth over raw power. Every tool had to be perfect, since obtaining new materials was dangerous and expensive. Every technique had to be mastered completely, since there was no room for waste or error in a community that depended on absolute self-sufficiency. "White man's forge makes noise like thunder," Two Bears observed in his broken English as he watched Ezra struggle with an unfamiliar hammering technique. "Cherokee forge whispers like wind. You learn whisper or you learn nothing." The language barrier created constant challenges that went far beyond simple communication. Cherokee concepts of time, ownership, and social relationships were fundamentally different from white American culture, and Ezra found himself making embarrassing mistakes that marked him as an outsider. When he offered to pay for his family's food and lodging, the gesture was seen as insulting rather than generous. When he tried to thank people individually for their kindness, he violated protocols about how gratitude should be expressed. When he disciplined Sarah for crying during a ceremony, he was gently but firmly corrected by Cherokee mothers who understood child rearing in ways that challenged everything he thought he knew about parenting. Ayanna became his translator and cultural guide, but she also had her own challenges to face. Her return to Cherokee society after years of solitary living created tensions she hadn't anticipated. Some community members questioned her decision to rescue a white man, viewing it as evidence that her time alone had compromised her judgment. Others resented her assumption of authority in bringing Ezra to the settlement without prior consultation. Most difficult of all were the expectations that she and Ezra would formalize their relationship according to Cherokee customs, assumptions that neither of them was prepared to address. The situation became more complicated when Little Hawk, a young Cherokee warrior who'd been courting Ayanna before her self-imposed exile, returned from a trading expedition to discover her caring for a white man's children as if they were her own. The confrontation between the two men was inevitable, but it came sooner and more publicly than anyone expected. It happened during the settlement's weekly council meeting, when community issues were discussed and decisions made collectively. Little Hawk stood before the gathered families and formally challenged Ezra's right to remain among them, citing specific Cherokee laws that prohibited white men from living in their territory. His speech was passionate and well-reasoned, touching on historical betrayals and the constant danger that discovery would bring to all their lives. "This white man brings death to our door," Little Hawk declared, his words carrying the weight of generational trauma. His enemies search for him with guns and gold. His children will grow up Cherokee, but they will always be white in the eyes of those who would destroy us. We risk everything for people who can never truly be Cherokee, no matter what names we give them or what ceremonies we perform. The challenge put Ezra in an impossible position. Cherokee customs demanded that he respond to Little Hawk's accusations, but doing so effectively required fluency in both language and cultural nuances that he hadn't yet mastered. More importantly, he recognized the validity of many of Little Hawk's concerns. His presence did endanger the community, and his daughters would indeed face unique challenges growing up between two worlds. It was Ayanna who provided the solution, standing to address the council with an authority that surprised even Ezra. She spoke in rapid Cherokee for several minutes, her voice carrying tones of command and conviction that gradually shifted the mood in the council house. When she finished, she turned to address Little Hawk directly in English, ensuring that Ezra could understand her words. "You speak of Cherokee lore and Cherokee survival," she said calmly, "but you forget Cherokee wisdom. The greatest leaders of our people were those who could see beyond the present danger to future possibilities. This man," she gestured toward Ezra, "brings skills we need, and children who will strengthen our numbers. More importantly, he brings something else, proof that not all white people are our enemies, that some can learn to live as Cherokee if we have the courage to teach them." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Little Hawk, you offer the safety of isolation, but isolation is not survival. It is slow death. If we are to endure as a people, we must grow and adapt while preserving what matters most. These children represent hope for a future where Cherokee and white can live in peace. If we reject them now, we reject that future." The debate that followed lasted until well past midnight, with arguments presented on all sides. Some elders supported Little Hawk's position, emphasizing the paramount importance of protecting the community from discovery. Others agreed with Ayanna, seeing Ezra's family as an opportunity to build bridges between cultures while strengthening Cherokee numbers. The women of the community were particularly vocal in supporting the children's right to remain, regardless of their father's fate. Finally, White Fox, the eldest council member, called for silence. His decision would carry enormous weight as he was recognized as the community's primary keeper of tradition and wisdom. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate, delivered in Cherokee and then carefully translated by Ayanna. "The Great Spirit has placed these children in our care for reasons we may not fully understand," White Fox said, "but the Great Spirit also gave us wisdom to see that protection sometimes requires risk. We will allow the man called Kanuna to remain among us, but under conditions that address Little Hawk's concerns." The conditions White Fox outlined were more stringent than anything previously discussed. Ezra would undergo a full year of probation, during which his behavior would be constantly monitored and evaluated. He would be required to master Cherokee language and customs completely, demonstrating his commitment through actions rather than words. Most challenging of all, he would have to prove his loyalty by undertaking dangerous missions that served Cherokee interests, including trading expeditions to white settlements where his capture would mean certain death. But the most significant condition involved his daughters. Sarah and Grace would be formally adopted by Cherokee families, with Ezra maintaining parental rights only as long as he proved worthy of them. If he failed any aspect of his probation, or if his presence brought danger to the community, the children would remain Cherokee while he was banished forever. As winter deepened and Ezra began his formal probation period, he threw himself into learning Cherokee ways with desperate intensity. Every morning found him at the forge with two bears, mastering techniques that required not just skill, but complete understanding of Cherokee approaches to craftsmanship. Every evening was spent with language teachers struggling to wrap his tongue around sounds that seemed designed to resist white vocal cords. Every spare moment was devoted to observing Cherokee customs, trying to understand the subtle social rules that governed community life. The learning process was complicated by the need to maintain absolute secrecy about the settlement's location and existence. Ezra quickly realized that he was being trained not just as a Cherokee craftsman, but as a potential spy who could move through white society while serving Cherokee interests. The skills they taught him, reading people's intentions, gathering information without arousing suspicion, maintaining false identities under pressure, were as sophisticated as anything practiced by military intelligence services. His first test came sooner than expected, when two bears informed him that he would be accompanying a trading party to Knoxville, the nearest major city. The mission was ostensibly commercial, selling Cherokee crafts and purchasing supplies that couldn't be obtained in the mountains. But Ezra soon learned that the real purpose was intelligence gathering, collecting information about military activities and government policies that might threaten the settlement's security. The preparation for this mission revealed just how sophisticated Cherokee survival strategies had become. Ezra was provided with forged papers identifying him as a traveling craftsman from Virginia, complete with a detailed backstory that would withstand casual investigation. His Cherokee companions would pose as his employees, Indians who had been civilized and were traveling under his supervision. The deception was complex and dangerous, requiring perfect coordination between people who were risking their lives to protect their community. As they prepared to leave the settlement for what might be Ezra's final test, he spent a sleepless night watching his daughters sleep peacefully in their Cherokee cradles. Sarah had begun speaking her first words, Cherokee words that came more naturally to her than English. Grace had learned to smile at Cherokee faces and reach for Cherokee hands with the same trust she once reserved for her father alone. They were already becoming the people they were meant to be in this world, and Ezra knew that whether he succeeded or failed in the coming trial, their future lay with the Cherokee people who had claimed them as their own. The irony wasn't lost on him that saving his daughters might ultimately mean losing them, that the only way to ensure their safety was to risk everything on a gamble that a white blacksmith could become Cherokee enough to earn the right to remain their father. As dawn broke over the hidden valley and the trading party prepared to venture into the dangerous world beyond, Ezra faced the greatest test of his transformation, not just of his skills or language, but of his very identity as a man caught between two worlds, fighting for the right to belong in either one. The city of Knoxville in the spring of 1890 was a bustling hub of commerce and corruption, where Cherokee traders could blend into the crowds if they were careful, and where wanted men could disappear among the thousands of faces, or be recognized by the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Ezra had never seen so many people in one place, nor had he ever felt so exposed despite his carefully constructed false identity. Walking through the busy streets with his Cherokee companions, he couldn't shake the feeling that every glance held recognition, every conversation might contain his name. The trading mission had started successfully enough. Two bears had taught him to pose as Marcus Sullivan, a Virginia craftsman specializing in metalwork, while his Cherokee companions, Running Wolf and Silent Creek, played the roles of his civilized Indian employees. Their cover story was solid. Sullivan was expanding his business westward, bringing his trained workers to demonstrate superior Cherokee craftsmanship to Tennessee merchants. It was a believable deception that explained their presence while allowing them to gather the intelligence they really sought. But Knoxville held dangers none of them had anticipated. The city was crawling with bounty hunters, drawn by Harold Brennan's increasingly desperate offers of reward money. The original $700 had grown to over 1,000, with additional incentives for information leading to Ezra's capture. Wanted posters bearing his likeness were displayed prominently in every tavern, hotel, and public building, making movement through the city a constant gamble with death. More troubling was the intelligence they gathered about Brennan's activities. The corrupt landowner had not been content with stealing Ezra's property. He had expanded his operations into a systematic campaign of fraud and intimidation, targeting dozens of small farmers throughout eastern Tennessee. Using the same tactics that had destroyed Ezra's life, Brennan was assembling a vast empire of stolen land, while the legal system either ignored his crimes or actively assisted them through bribed officials. The scope of Brennan's corruption became clear during their second day in Knoxville, when Running Wolf overheard a conversation between two territorial officials in a hotel restaurant. Brennan had apparently convinced the governor that Cherokee settlements in the mountains represented a threat to white expansion, leading to plans for a massive military sweep designed to locate and destroy any hidden communities. The operation was scheduled to begin within weeks, with bounty hunters and local militias serving as scouts to identify Cherokee locations. This intelligence was far more valuable and dangerous than anything they had expected to discover. If accurate, it meant that every Cherokee settlement in Tennessee was facing imminent destruction, with their own hidden community likely among the primary targets. The mission's objectives suddenly shifted from routine information gathering to desperate espionage that could mean the survival or extinction of their people. It was while attempting to gather more specific details about the planned military operation that their carefully maintained cover began to unravel. Ezra had been posing as Marcus Sullivan for 3 days, successfully convincing merchants and officials that he was exactly what he claimed to be. But his luck ran out during a visit to the territorial courthouse, where he hoped to access public records that might reveal more about Brennan's land acquisitions. The clerk who assisted him was a nervous young man named Timothy Holt, who seemed eager to be helpful but also strangely agitated by Ezra's presence. At first, Ezra attributed this to the general nervousness that many white officials displayed around Indians, even civilized ones. But as their conversation continued, Holt's behavior became increasingly erratic, his eyes constantly darting toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive. "You know, Mr. Sullivan," Holt said as he retrieved the requested documents, "you remind me of someone. Can't quite place it, but there's something familiar about your face." He paused, studying Ezra more carefully. "Have we met before? Perhaps in Virginia?" Ezra's blood turned to ice, but he maintained his composure with the skill Two Bears had taught him. "I don't believe so," he replied calmly, "though I suppose all blacksmiths start to look alike after a while. We're all scarred by the same fires and hammers." Holt laughed nervously, but his suspicion was clearly growing. "Yes, I suppose that's true. Still, there's something—" He trailed off, then suddenly brightened with apparent recognition. "Wait here just a moment, Mr. Sullivan. I need to check something in the back office." The moment Holt disappeared, Ezra knew their mission had been compromised. Every instinct screamed at him to flee immediately, but Running Wolf and Silent Creek were still gathering intelligence in other parts of the courthouse, and abandoning them would mean certain death for all three. Instead, Ezra made a desperate decision that would haunt him for years to come. Moving quickly but carefully, he accessed the clerk's desk and began searching through official correspondence for any mention of military operations against Cherokee settlements. What he found exceeded his worst fears: detailed maps showing suspected Cherokee locations, troop deployment schedules, and orders for a coordinated assault that would begin in less than 2 weeks. The scale of the planned operation was staggering, involving federal troops, state militias, and civilian bounty hunters in a sweep designed to eliminate Cherokee presence in Tennessee permanently. But as Ezra photographed the documents using a miniature camera Two Bears had provided, a sophisticated device that demonstrated the Cherokee community's advanced technology, he discovered something that made his hands shake with rage. Harold Brennan wasn't just supporting the military operation. He was financing it, providing maps and intelligence while positioning himself to claim Cherokee lands as abandoned property once their inhabitants were killed or deported. The documents revealed Brennan's ultimate plan with crystalline clarity. He intended to use the military sweep to eliminate not just Cherokee communities, but also any witnesses to his fraudulent land acquisitions. Ezra's case was just one of dozens, and many of the farmers who had been cheated were now living in the same remote areas targeted for Cherokee removal. The military operation would serve as cover for the systematic murder of anyone who could testify against Brennan's criminal empire. Ezra was still photographing documents when Timothy Holt returned with Sheriff Coleman, the same corrupt official who had arrested him in Millerville months earlier. The recognition was mutual and immediate, with Coleman's hand moving instinctively to his gun as he realized who was standing before him. "Well, well," Coleman drawled, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man about to collect a substantial bounty. "Marcus Sullivan, is it? That's mighty interesting, considering I've got a wanted poster back in my office that says you're Ezra Whitmore, wanted for theft and kidnapping." He smiled coldly. "That's $1,000 mistake you just made, friend." The confrontation that followed tested every skill Ezra had learned during his Cherokee training. Coleman was confident in his advantage, believing he had cornered a desperate fugitive with no allies or resources. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Cherokee intelligence network in Knoxville was far more extensive than any white official suspected, with Running Wolf and Silent Creek coordinating with Cherokee agents throughout the city to create escape routes and diversions. The rescue operation that extracted Ezra from the courthouse was a masterpiece of Cherokee tactical planning. While Coleman was calling for reinforcements and preparing to transport his valuable prisoner, Cherokee operatives created a series of carefully orchestrated distractions throughout the city. Fires broke out in 3 different warehouses, drawing fire departments and law enforcement away from the courthouse. A staged fight between rival trading groups blocked major streets, preventing rapid movement of troops. Most cleverly, a Cherokee agent posed as a federal marshal arrived at the courthouse with official-looking papers claiming jurisdiction over the Whitmore case, creating enough confusion for Ezra to slip away during the bureaucratic argument that followed. But the successful escape came at a terrible cost. Their cover was completely blown, with every law enforcement agency in Tennessee now searching for Marcus Sullivan and his Cherokee accomplices. More importantly, the intelligence they had gathered revealed that their hidden community had less than 2 weeks before facing the largest military assault in the region's history. The journey back to the settlement was a nightmare of evasion and desperation, with pursuing forces closing in from multiple directions. They were forced to abandon their horses and travel on foot through terrain so difficult that only Cherokee knowledge of secret trails allowed them to stay ahead of their hunters. For 5 days, they moved through valleys and ridges that existed on no official maps, sleeping in caves and surviving on emergency rations while federal troops and bounty hunters combed the mountains around them. When they finally reached the hidden valley, they found the settlement already preparing for war. Cherokee scouts had detected unusual military activity throughout the region, and the community's leaders had begun implementing emergency protocols developed over decades of survival. Children and elderly were being evacuated to even more remote locations, while warriors prepared defensive positions designed to make any assault as costly as possible for attackers. Ezra's return with concrete intelligence about Brennan's involvement and the operation's timeline galvanized the community's resistance planning, but it also created a crisis of leadership that threatened to tear the settlement apart. Little Hawk and his supporters argued that Ezra's blown cover had compromised everyone's safety. that his presence had drawn exactly the kind of attention they had feared from the beginning. The fact that he had obtained crucial intelligence was irrelevant if that intelligence came at the cost of exposing their location to enemies. The debate raged for hours in the council house, with families divided between those who saw Ezra as a hero who had risked everything to warn them and those who viewed him as the cause of their impending destruction. Ayanna found herself defending him against increasingly hostile accusations, while Ezra struggled with the guilt of knowing that his past had indeed brought death to the doorstep of people who had offered him sanctuary. It was White Fox who finally cut through the arguments with a wisdom that transcended blame and recrimination. "The enemy comes whether we fight among ourselves or stand together," the old chief said quietly. "What matters now is not who brought this danger, but how we respond to it. We can die as scattered refugees, or we can stand as Cherokee warriors defending our home." His words shifted the community's focus from internal conflict to external survival, but the damage to Ezra's standing was severe. Many Cherokee families no longer trusted him with their lives, viewing him as a liability whose presence endangered their children. The formal adoption of Sarah and Grace became even more critical, as community members made it clear that the babies would be protected regardless of their father's fate. As night fell over the settlement and families prepared for what might be their final weeks together, Ezra sat with his daughters outside the lodge that had become their temporary home. Sarah was now walking unsteadily but with determination, chattering in Cherokee words that came more naturally than English. Grace had learned to clap her hands and laugh at Cherokee songs, responding to Cherokee faces with the same joy she had. Once reserved for her father, alone, they were becoming Cherokee children, just as the council had intended, and Ezra realized with painful clarity that his success in protecting them might ultimately require his own sacrifice. If the community decided that his presence made their defense impossible, he would have to leave, alone, trusting in the people who had saved his daughters to continue protecting them when he could not. The final test of his transformation was about to begin, but this time the stakes weren't just his acceptance into Cherokee society, they were the survival of everyone he had come to love, and the future of two innocent children whose lives had become the center of a conflict that would determine whether hope or hatred would triumph in the mountains of Tennessee. The attack came at dawn on the 10th day, not with the thunderous charge of cavalry that everyone had expected, but with the silent approach of professional killers who had studied Cherokee tactics and adapted their own strategies accordingly. Harold Brennan had hired mercenaries, former Confederate soldiers who specialized in what they euphemistically called Indian removal, men who understood that the hidden Cherokee settlement represented not just a military target, but a treasure trove of valuable land that would make them all wealthy if they could eliminate its inhabitants quietly and completely. Ezra was on watch duty at the settlement's eastern perimeter when he spotted the first scout, a lean man in buckskins who moved through the forest with practiced stealth. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across 50 yards of mountain wilderness, each recognizing in the other a dangerous adversary. Then, the mercenary reached for his rifle, and Ezra's Cherokee training took over. The silent throwing knife that Two Bears had taught him to use struck its target before the scout could raise his weapon, but the damage was already done. The attack had begun. The warning cry that Ezra sent echoing through the valley triggered defensive preparations that the Cherokee had spent months perfecting. Children and elderly disappeared into hidden caves and underground shelters that had been carved into the mountainside over generations. Warriors took positions behind carefully, constructed barriers that appeared to be natural rock formations but were actually sophisticated fortifications. Most importantly, the community's women began implementing an evacuation plan that would preserve Cherokee bloodlines even if the settlement itself was lost. But this battle would be unlike any the Cherokee had fought before. Brennan's mercenaries weren't government soldiers bound by military regulations or political considerations. They were killers, motivated by greed and racial hatred, men who viewed Cherokee lives as obstacles to profit rather than human beings deserving of mercy. Their orders were explicit: eliminate every witness, claim the land, and ensure that no one survived to tell the story of what had happened in this hidden valley. The first assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, with mercenaries using Cherokee trails and hiding places that someone had obviously scouted in advance. The attackers moved with deadly efficiency, their tactics suggesting intimate knowledge of the settlement's layout and defensive positions. As Cherokee warriors fell under accurate rifle fire from concealed positions, it became clear that this wasn't a spontaneous attack. It was the result of careful planning and inside information. Ezra fought alongside Cherokee warriors whose names he had learned during his months of probation, men who had initially viewed him with suspicion but had gradually accepted him as a brother in arms. Running Wolf died saving Cherokee children, taking 3 bullets while providing cover for families fleeing toward hidden caves. Silent Creek fell defending the settlement's water supply, his final act being to trigger a rock slide that buried 5 mercenaries along with himself. 2 Bears, the master craftsman, who had become Ezra's mentor and friend, fought with hammers and Cherokee war axes until overwhelming numbers brought him down. As the battle raged through the morning, it became increasingly clear that the Cherokee were losing despite their desperate courage. The mercenaries had superior numbers, better weapons, and the advantage of surprise. More troubling, they seemed to know exactly where Cherokee defensive positions were located, suggesting that someone had provided them with detailed intelligence about the settlement's layout. The horrible truth became apparent when Harold Brennan himself appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, accompanied by Sheriff Coleman and a group of federal marshals whose presence gave legal cover to what was essentially a massacre. But Brennan hadn't come just to witness the destruction. He had come to claim a specific prize that had eluded him for months. Ezra Whitmore. Brennan's voice echoed across the battle-torn settlement, amplified by a speaking trumpet that carried his words to every corner of the valley. I know you're down there, you pathetic fool. Did you really think you could hide among savages and escape justice? Come out now, and I'll make sure your brats die quickly instead of slowly. The ultimatum that followed was delivered with the cold calculation of a man who held all the cards. Brennan had positioned sharpshooters at every escape route from the valley, making flight impossible. He had federal marshals ready to testify that the Cherokee settlement was an illegal gathering of hostile Indians who had fired on law enforcement officers. Most devastatingly, he had captured several Cherokee families during their attempted evacuation, including children who would be executed one by one until Ezra surrendered himself. But Brennan had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that the Cherokee would abandon Ezra to save themselves, that their loyalty to a white refugee would crumble under the pressure of survival. He couldn't have been more wrong about the bonds that had been forged in the hidden valley, or the transformation that had taken place in a desperate father's heart. The Cherokee Council's emergency session lasted less than 5 minutes, with White Fox speaking for the entire community when he addressed Ezra directly. You are Cherokee now, the old chief said simply. Cherokee do not abandon Cherokee no matter the cost. We fight together or we die together, but we do not surrender our family to enemies. Ayana's contribution to the battle planning was characteristically bold and completely unexpected. While the men focused on military tactics, she had been developing a plan that would turn Brennan's greed against him. The hidden valley contained more than just a Cherokee settlement. It was also home to sacred sites that held spiritual significance for tribes throughout the region. More importantly for Brennan's purposes, it contained natural resources that made it even more valuable than he had realized. Brennan wants this land for its timber and water rights, Ayanna explained to the assembled warriors, but he doesn't know about the silver deposits that Cherokee miners discovered last year. If we can convince him that surrendering Ezra will give him access to mineral wealth worth 10 times what he expected, his greed might make him careless. The deception that followed was a masterpiece of Cherokee psychological warfare. Using carefully placed evidence and strategic leaks of information, they convinced Brennan that the settlement was built on top of one of the richest silver veins in Tennessee history. The Cherokee had supposedly been mining precious metals for decades, accumulating wealth that Brennan could claim along with the land itself. All he had to do was allow the Cherokee to leave peacefully after turning over Ezra, and the mineral rights would be his without further bloodshed. Brennan's response revealed both his overwhelming greed and his fundamental stupidity. Instead of pressing his military advantage to complete the massacre, he called for a temporary ceasefire to negotiate terms. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of dozens of families was now willing to let Cherokee savages escape in exchange for access to imaginary silver deposits. His mercenaries were ordered to hold their positions while he entered the settlement under a flag of truce to inspect the supposed mining operations. The trap that awaited Brennan in the valley was the culmination of months of Cherokee preparation and centuries of tactical wisdom. What appeared to be mining tunnels were actually carefully constructed kill zones, designed to channel attackers into areas where they could be easily eliminated. The silver ore that Brennan examined so greedily was actually painted rock, prepared by Cherokee artists whose skill in deception matched their talent in traditional crafts. But the real trap wasn't physical, it was legal. Ayanna had spent the previous night preparing documents that would expose Brennan's criminal empire to federal authorities who weren't under his control. The evidence of his fraudulent land acquisitions, his bribery of local officials, and his financing of illegal military operations had been compiled into a comprehensive case that would destroy him even if he survived the current battle. The confrontation between Ezra and Brennan took place in the settlement's council house, with Cherokee witnesses recording every word for posterity. Face to face with the man who had destroyed his life and murdered his wife through legal machinations, Ezra found himself strangely calm. The months of Cherokee training had taught him that revenge was less important than justice, and that true strength came from protecting others rather than harming enemies. "You've lost, Brennan," Ezra said quietly, as the corrupt landowner examined forged mining documents. "Even if you kill every Cherokee in this valley, the evidence of your crimes is already in the hands of honest federal judges. Your empire of stolen land is about to collapse, and everyone you've cheated will finally have justice." Brennan's reaction was swift and predictably violent, but he had badly underestimated both Ezra's Cherokee training and the loyalty of his mercenary followers. When he drew his pistol to shoot Ezra on the spot, Cherokee warriors emerged from concealment throughout the council house. More importantly, several of Brennan's own men realized that their employer was leading them into a trap that would make them accessories to crimes that carried federal death penalties. The brief firefight that followed ended with Brennan wounded and captured, his mercenary force scattered or dead, and Sheriff Coleman fleeing toward Knoxville with federal marshals in pursuit. The corrupt network that had seemed so powerful just hours earlier crumbled like a house built on sand once its leader was removed and its crimes exposed to honest law enforcement. But victory came at a terrible cost that would reshape the survivors' lives forever. More than 30 Cherokee warriors had died defending their home, including many of the men who had become Ezra's closest friends and mentors. The settlement itself was too damaged to remain viable, forcing the community to scatter to other Cherokee refugees throughout the mountains. Most heartbreaking of all, the children who had been evacuated during the battle would be raised in different communities, their childhood bonds severed by the necessities of survival. As spring turned to summer and the immediate crisis passed, Ezra found himself facing a choice he had never expected to confront. Federal authorities, grateful for his role in exposing Brennan's criminal network, had offered him full pardons and the return of his stolen property. He could reclaim his old life, raise his daughters as white children in the world they had been born into, and put the trauma of the past year behind them. The temptation was enormous, especially when he considered how much easier life would be for Sarah and Grace if they grew up as white rather than Cherokee. They would face no discrimination, no constant threat of removal, no need to hide their identities or live in fear of discovery. They could have education, opportunities, and security that Cherokee children could never take for granted. But as Ezra watched his daughters playing with Cherokee children in the temporary camp where survivors had gathered, he realized that the choice wasn't really his to make. Sarah spoke Cherokee more fluently than English now, and Grace had learned Cherokee songs before she learned white lullabies. They called Cherokee women grandmother, and Cherokee men uncle, with the same natural affection they had once reserved for their birth family. Most importantly, they had never known safety except among Cherokee people, never experienced love except from Cherokee hearts. The decision that Ezra announced to the Cherokee Council surprised no one who had truly understood his transformation. He would claim his legal vindication and the return of his property, but only to deed the land to Cherokee refugees who needed a safe place to rebuild their lives. He would maintain his white identity in legal documents while living as Cherokee, in his heart and home. His daughters would grow up knowing both worlds, but belonging fully to the people who had saved their lives when their own society had failed them. Ayana's role in this new life was formalized through a Cherokee marriage ceremony that took place. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, she had proven herself not just as a warrior and healer, but as a bridge between worlds that could coexist when people of goodwill chose cooperation over conflict. Together, they would raise Sarah and Grace as Cherokee daughters while teaching them to navigate the white world that would always be part of their heritage. As winter approached once again, a full year after the blizzard that had changed everything, Ezra stood on the porch of the cabin he had rebuilt on land that was now legally Cherokee territory. His daughters were learning to walk in snow that had once nearly claimed their lives, chattering in Cherokee about the wonders of their mountain home. Behind them, smoke rose from chimneys in a small village where Cherokee families lived openly. For the first time in decades, protected by federal recognition and legal documents that could not be easily dismissed. The transformation was complete, but it had never really been about changing from white to Cherokee. It had been about learning that family is defined by love rather than blood, that home is created by acceptance rather than birth, and that the greatest strength comes from protecting others rather than advancing oneself. In saving his daughters, Ezra had discovered not just a new identity, but a new understanding of what it meant to be truly human in a world that too often measured worth by the color of skin rather than the content of character. The winter that had once threatened to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger than they could ever have been alone, a family bound not by tragedy, but by choice, not by circumstance, but by love that transcended every barrier that hatred could construct. And as snow began to fall on their mountain home, 3 lives that had been saved by Cherokee compassion were now devoted to ensuring that such compassion would never be forgotten or unrewarded. 25 years after the winter that changed everything, Sarah Cloudwalker Whitmore stood before the Tennessee state legislature as the first Cherokee woman ever elected to public office. Her speech notes written in both English and Cherokee as she prepared to address lawmakers about the Native American Education Act she had spent 3 years crafting. In the gallery above, her sister Grace sat with their elderly father Kanuna, the man the white world still knew as Ezra Whitmore, and their Cherokee mother Ayanna, whose silver-streaked hair was adorned with the same eagle feathers she had worn at their wedding ceremony decades earlier. The transformation of that legislative chamber would have been impossible to imagine in 1890, when Cherokee people were considered hostile savages to be eliminated or removed. Now, in 1915, Sarah's presence at the podium represented something unprecedented in American history: the successful integration of Cherokee leadership into the democratic process, achieved not through assimilation that destroyed cultural identity, but through a delicate balance that honored both Cherokee traditions and American legal principles. Sarah's journey to this moment had been extraordinary by any measure, but it was also representative of the broader changes that had swept through Tennessee and the surrounding states. The legal precedent established by her father's case against Harold Brennan had opened doors for countless other victims of land fraud, creating a pathway for Cherokee families to reclaim properties that had been stolen through corrupt legal proceedings. More importantly, it had forced state and federal governments to acknowledge that Cherokee communities had never ceased to exist, even during the darkest periods of official persecution. The Cherokee settlement that had grown up around the Whitmore homestead had become a model for indigenous self-governance that attracted attention from scholars, politicians, and tribal leaders throughout North America. Here, Cherokee families lived openly and prosperously, operating businesses, schools, and cultural institutions that served both Cherokee and white communities. The success of this experiment in coexistence had gradually shifted public opinion away from the elimination policies that had dominated the 19th century toward recognition that indigenous peoples could be valuable contributors to American society without abandoning their cultural identities. Grace's path had been different, but equally remarkable. Where Sarah had chosen law and politics as her arena for change, Grace had become a physician, graduating from the newly established Cherokee Medical College that combined traditional healing practices with modern Western medicine. Her research into Cherokee herbal remedies had led to breakthroughs in treating diseases that conventional medicine had struggled to address, earning her recognition in medical journals throughout the United States and Europe. But perhaps more importantly, Grace had pioneered a new approach to healthcare that integrated Cherokee spiritual practices with scientific methodology, creating treatment protocols that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the cultural and emotional needs of indigenous patients. Her clinic, located in the heart of the Cherokee settlement, served patients of all backgrounds while training a new generation of indigenous healers who could navigate both traditional and modern medical systems. The success of both sisters had been built on the foundation that their parents had created through years of patient bridge building between Cherokee and white communities. Ayanna had become a respected cultural ambassador, traveling throughout the country to speak at universities and government institutions about Cherokee history and contemporary life. Her presentations invariably challenged audiences to reconsider their assumptions about indigenous peoples while offering practical models for respectful coexistence. Ezra's role had been more behind the scenes, but equally crucial. His transformation from desperate refugee to Cherokee community leader had made him uniquely qualified to help other white individuals and families navigate the complex process of cultural adoption. Over the years, he had assisted dozens of people, some fleeing legal troubles like his own, others simply seeking a more meaningful way of life in finding acceptance within Cherokee communities. His success rate was remarkable, though he was always careful to emphasize that such transitions required complete commitment to Cherokee values and customs, not just superficial adoption of external practices. The economic prosperity of the Cherokee settlement had also contributed to changing attitudes throughout Tennessee. Cherokee businesses had become integral to the regional economy, with Cherokee craftsmen, farmers, and traders earning reputations for superior quality and honest dealing. The Cherokee Bank, established with Ezra's initial property deed as collateral, had grown into one of the most trusted financial institutions in the state, serving customers regardless of their cultural background while prioritizing loans for sustainable development projects. Education had been another area where the Cherokee settlement had pioneered innovative approaches that attracted national attention. The Cherokee Academy provided instruction in both Cherokee and English languages, while offering curricula that integrated indigenous knowledge systems with conventional academic subjects. Students learned Cherokee history and traditions alongside mathematics and science, developing bilingual and bicultural competencies that prepared them for success in multiple environments. White families throughout the region had begun requesting enrollment for their children at the Cherokee Academy, recognizing that the school's unique approach produced graduates who were exceptionally well prepared for the increasingly interconnected world of the early 20th century. The waiting list for admission had grown so long that the school had expanded multiple times, each expansion funded through a combination of Cherokee resources and donations from white supporters who valued the institution's educational innovation. The cultural renaissance that had flourished within the Cherokee settlement had also had profound effects on Cherokee communities throughout the country. Traditional arts, crafts, and ceremonial practices that had been suppressed or nearly lost during the removal era experienced revival as Cherokee families felt safe to openly express their cultural identities. The settlement's annual festivals attracted visitors from hundreds of miles away, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and economic development while strengthening connections between Cherokee communities that had been scattered by historical trauma. Sarah's legislative work had been instrumental in creating legal frameworks that protected these cultural practices while ensuring that Cherokee communities could participate fully in American economic and political systems. Her Native American Education Act was just one of several pieces of legislation she had authored to address the unique challenges faced by indigenous communities in the modern era. But the most significant changes had been generational, visible in the children who had grown up in the integrated community that had emerged around the Cherokee settlement. These young people moved effortlessly between Cherokee and white social contexts, equally comfortable participating in traditional ceremonies and modern civic institutions. They spoke Cherokee at home and English in business settings, practiced traditional crafts while pursuing contemporary careers, and maintained spiritual connections to ancestral lands while embracing technological innovations. As Sarah concluded her legislative address and received enthusiastic applause from lawmakers who 25 years earlier would have refused to acknowledge Cherokee humanity, she reflected on the journey that had brought her family and community to this moment. The desperate flight through a winter blizzard had led not just to survival, but to transformation that had rippled outward to affect thousands of lives in ways that continued to expand with each passing year. After the legislative session, the family gathered for dinner at the Cherokee settlement, now officially incorporated as the town of New Lakota in honor of the original Cherokee capital. The meal was prepared according to traditional Cherokee methods, but served in a dining room that reflected the community's successful integration of indigenous and contemporary elements. Conversations flowed seamlessly between Cherokee and English, with family members sharing updates about their various projects and accomplishments. Ayanna, now in her 50s but still vital and engaged, had recently completed a comprehensive documentation of Cherokee medicinal practices that would be published by Harvard University Press. Her work had involved traveling to Cherokee communities throughout the United States and Canada, collecting knowledge from elders who had preserved traditional healing practices despite decades of suppression. The resulting volume would serve as both a scientific resource and a cultural preservation project, ensuring that indigenous medical knowledge would be available to future generations. Ezra, whose Cherokee name Kanuna had become his preferred identity even in white society, had recently been appointed to serve on the Tennessee Historical Commission, where his unique perspective as someone who had lived through the transition from persecution to recognition made him a valuable contributor to efforts to accurately document the state's indigenous history. His work focused particularly on correcting historical narratives that had minimized or ignored Cherokee contributions to Tennessee's development. Grace's medical practice had expanded to include a research institute that attracted visiting scholars from throughout North America and Europe. Her integration of traditional Cherokee healing practices with modern medical techniques had produced treatment protocols that were being adopted by hospitals and clinics far beyond Tennessee. More importantly, her success had opened doors for other indigenous healers to gain recognition within the conventional medical establishment. Sarah's political career continued to break new ground, with speculation that she might seek election to the U.S. Congress or even consideration for a federal judicial appointment. Her legal expertise in indigenous rights had made her a sought-after consultant for tribal governments throughout the country, while her legislative experience provided practical insights into the political processes necessary to effect meaningful change. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of a third generation that represented the full realization of the cultural bridge building that had begun with Ezra's desperate flight into Cherokee territory. Sarah's eldest son, Thomas Cloudwalker, had been accepted to study law at Yale University while maintaining his commitment to Cherokee cultural practices. Grace's daughter, Rebecca Two Bears, was pursuing medical training while conducting research into traditional Cherokee pharmaceutical knowledge. These young people embodied the possibility that had driven their grandparents' sacrifices, the vision of a world where indigenous and non-indigenous peoples could coexist with mutual respect and shared prosperity. They moved through elite educational institutions and professional environments while maintaining strong connections to Cherokee communities and traditions, serving as living examples of successful cultural integration. As evening settled over, New Lakota and the family prepared to part ways after their reunion dinner. Ezra found himself standing on the porch of the house he had built on land that Rebecca had never seen but would have been proud to call home. The view encompassed the thriving Cherokee settlement below, with its mix of traditional and contemporary architecture, its bustling commercial district where Cherokee and white businesses operated side by side, and its schools where children learned to navigate multiple cultural worlds with confidence and pride. The transformation had required sacrifices that were still felt keenly by those who remembered the early days of struggle and uncertainty. Too many Cherokee warriors had died defending the Hidden Valley. Too many families had been separated by the necessities of survival. Too many cultural practices had been lost during the years of hiding and fear. But from those sacrifices had emerged something unprecedented in American history, a successful model for indigenous sovereignty that operated within rather than in opposition to the broader American political and economic systems. The winter of 1889 had brought Ezra Whitmore to the edge of death with two newborn daughters whose survival had seemed impossible. The Cherokee woman who had rescued them had set in motion changes that had transformed not just their individual lives, but the broader relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples throughout the region. Their story had become legend, told in Cherokee communities as an example of how compassion could triumph over hatred, how cultural bridges could be built even in the most unlikely circumstances. As snow began to fall once again, a gentle reminder of that fateful winter 26 years earlier, Ezra reflected on the promise he had made to Rebecca as she lay dying, his vow to keep their daughters safe and ensure they knew how much they were loved. He had kept that promise, though in ways he never could have imagined when he first spoke those words. Sarah and Grace had grown up not just safe, but empowered to become leaders who would protect and nurture future generations. They had known love not just from their birth parents, but from an entire community that had claimed them as daughters and raised them to understand their responsibility to serve others. The legacy of that winter storm extended far beyond one family's survival story. It had become a testament to the possibility of transformation, a proof that even the most entrenched systems of hatred and oppression could be challenged successfully when people of goodwill chose courage over fear, compassion over cruelty, and hope over despair. In the warm light spilling from windows throughout New Echota, in the laughter of children who would grow up free from the fears that had haunted their grandparents, in the success of young adults who moved confidently between worlds that had once been separated by seemingly insurmountable barriers. The true measure of that transformation could be seen. The widower's winter had ended, but its legacy of love, courage, and cultural bridge building would continue to shape lives and communities for generations to come, a reminder that the most profound changes often begin with a single act of mercy, offered by one stranger to another in their moment of greatest need. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.